talk about drones and drones warfare, and the morality of drone warfare. And I think sometimes the politics gets too much involved in it. And personally, as a Marine, I like drones. Anytime you can use a drone instead of using a Marine, I think it's a good thing. And I would prefer to use them for surveillance, observation, and if needed, weapons delivery instead of having to use a Marine or a soldier or a sailor or an airman. And I think they indeed do save lives. Of course, the technology has advanced greatly over the years, and they've become extremely accurate. And they're doing phenomenal work in Afghanistan and many other theaters. We at ASP realized, however, that there's a strategic debate that's not taking place, and we think we can put that a little into context and perhaps frame it possibly. We intend to take this debate today, put it down in papers, have a study group, and maybe hopefully write down some points that the administration can use, that government can use, and how they're going to use drones. We also need to link other facets of American power to drones, whether it be development or democratic support, economic engagement, and other such instruments. Our fellow for asymmetric warfare and terrorism, Josh Faust, has written a lot about drones. He's going to moderate our session today. Following Josh will be Aaron Zelin, who's the Borough Fellow at the Washington Institute, Will McCants, who's an analyst at CNA, and Christine Fair, an assistant professor at Georgetown. We hope to adjourn at 1:30. We might run a little bit late, depending if you could stay. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Josh.
Thanks, Steve. So as Steve said, we're planning on this being a strategic discussion, meaning we want to look at the big picture, and we want to look at the big picture as it changes over time. A lot of the discussion about drones, as it has evolved in the public over a year and a half or so, have been focused primarily on tactical issues. So individual questions of who gets killed, individual questions about single strikes, things of that nature. We're interested in the much bigger picture here. So that means talking about effects, and specifically talking about long-term effects. A lot of academic studies about drones try really hard to get at this, but they're ultimately not sufficient for making strategic judgments. Part of this is because they focus on the tactical level of drones, meaning counting casualties, trying to do very temporally limited analysis where they make an arbitrary delineation of time, an arbitrary number of strikes within that time, and from there try to generalize outward. But from a broad perspective, we know that in several places around the world, drones offer quick tactical victories, but dubious strategic benefits. I think one of the most interesting places where that's happening right now is Yemen, where drones have been effective at killing a lot of suspected terrorists. They've also been effective at sparking a certain amount of political backlash in the countryside. That backlash might be worth the effect of drones, but at the strategic level, the question of how you balance those costs and benefits is not happening. And that's part of what we're hoping to raise today. One thing Professor Fair is going to be talking about is inside Pakistan, how we can make that determination of the tactical benefits of going after terrorists this way, with some of the limitations in understanding the effects afterward. So the ultimate purpose of what we're doing here, and this is how the conversation is going to evolve, is arriving at an effective strategy for how we can use drones in a reasonable and constructive way. In a lot of ways, drones have taken the place of U.S. strategic decision-making. People think there's a problem, it's a difficult place to get to, let's send in drones, that solves the problem. That might solve part of the problem, but it might not solve another part of the problem. And looking at it from this high-level strategic perspective is, I think, how we're going to be able to arrive at that effective policy. So without further ado, I guess we can just go down the table and start with Professor Fair and head on down.
Okay, very well. So, okay, no problem. What I want to do is draw your attention to the pieces that Josh Faust and his associate Ashley wrote. I think they did a really good job at trying to pull together a lot of disparate data to inform this discussion. In fact, it was those pieces that informed in some measure the way I have framed my talking points. I want to be also very clear that I'm not a drone expert. I'm a South Asianist. Right, so I'm going to be talking about drones only with regard to the federally administered tribal areas in Pakistan. I can also talk to some extent about the two programs, overt and covert, that are used in Afghanistan and the problems they're in, but my points are really going to be focused upon FATA. I'm not a comparativist either, so let me just lay out why FATA me, apart from the South Asians, and that's within my geographical review, is a very unique case. And it is the uniqueness of that case which very much conditions my preference for the use of drones. First, Pakistan itself is a unique case, right? If we had the Venn diagram of our enemies and their enemies, we would see that there are approximately 3 kinds of categories. There are the enemies that we have in common, that we jointly want to eliminate through kills, captures, what have you. There are their allies that we would like to kill or eliminate. By that I'm talking about Lashkar-e-Taiba, the Haqqani network, the Afghan Taliban, and so forth. And then there are a selection of militants that are Pakistan's problem, but are not ours. In some cases, we've done a goodwill kill. For example, Baytullah Masood, he wasn't our problem. He wasn't supporting suicide bombers in Afghanistan. We took him out in 2009 as a goodwill kill to show good faith for the Pakistanis. The problem is that with each of those kinds of targets, and by the way, they're not stable, an enemy of Pakistan can become an ally if they simply agree to not attack the ISI or the Pak military, is that when they are cooperating with us on some of those targets, they're actively undermining us in others, okay? So in some cases, they're helping us with our drone targets. In some cases, they are helping the fellows to abscond even as we're coming after them. This is why we can't just give them the target set and give them the joystick. By the way, I want to put to rest, I don't even like discussion of they're not being piloted. Right now, the drones in Fatah are piloted. It's no different from my point of view of the pilot sitting in the cockpit flying over the Atlantic in the middle of the night, because he's not flying by sight, he's flying by instruments. In this case, the pilot is happening to be looking at instruments that are dislocated from the aircraft, right? So the pilot, nonsense, I think it obfuscates, it doesn't help. In Fatah, it does not, the Pakistan Penal Code does not apply. What does apply is a 19th century British colonial structure called the Frontier Crimes Regulation. It is truly a piece of odious legislation. It actually calls for collective punishment. So even if we took the drone haters' most aggressive numbers of the innocents that are killed in collateral damage, it's actually completely within the remit of the Frontier Crimes Regulation. And they kill far fewer than the Pakistan security forces when they've gone into Fatah. Unfortunately, because the Frontier Crimes Regulation is the only piece of legislation that operates there, it means there are no police, there are no law enforcement agencies, which means that we're relying upon the Pak military, and I've already discussed their problems. The Frontier Corps, some of you may not know that under Nasrullah Babar, not under Zia, but under Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, when Pakistan first drafted its Afghan policy, the Frontier Corps was used to train, arm, and otherwise assist Islamist militants. They continued to do this up into the Taliban. We've made them at different points a part of our counterinsurgency strategy, apparently without regard to history. So oddly, when we look at all of these things, drones are actually not only our only option, but I think they're also the least horrible option, at least based upon some of the information that I have available. I will say finally, before moving on to what are the empirical requirements to come to a more robust assessment, leaving aside the fact that we have whittled down the option set to virtually one thing. Even if PAC-MIL decided to take on itself that it's going to go after the Haqqani network, what we have seen from PAC-MIL operations is that they're very imprecise, kill loads of people, and let me just bring your attention to one statistic. Drones have not displaced millions of people. People are not fleeing drones, right? PAC-MIL displaced at one point as many as 4 million people from SWAT, okay? So even if they wanted to take this on, they couldn't do it with the precision and with the what I'm going to call the least negative externalities that the drone program appear to be doing. But all of this is not an assessment. All of this is simply wheedling down the option set to a very small number, and that appears to be unmanned aerial vehicles, but as I'm going to say, elsewhere manned or elsewhere woman aerial vehicles, because that's actually more descriptive of what these things are. So what do we actually need to know to come up with a strategic assessment that Josh and Ashley put forward in their very thoughtful set of questions to guide such an analysis? The first thing we actually need to know, and this may sound obvious, but it's not, is who did we try to kill, and who did we actually kill? Now, some of you may be familiar with the New American Foundation data set. I'm not going to call it a data set. I'm going to call it a collection of news reports. Similarly, the BIJ effort. Unfortunately, those are not what they say they are. They say they've done independent confirmation. They didn't do independent confirmation because they can't. No foreign journalists can go into Fatah. What they've basically done is they've compiled news reports. And the way Pakistan, by the way, if you don't know, ISI has a media wing whose job it is to influence domestic and international media. If you don't know that, you should know that, because that's part of our problem. So Taliban calls someone up, ISI calls someone up. By the way, they do plan stories. This is not hearsay, it's just a fact. Even Ajaz Haider, The khaki boy has written a piece decrying the ISI media wing. So don't just take it from me, take it from the boy who defends the khakis, even when they're slaughtering folk in Balochistan. So if it comes from him, you can trust him. Or not. So what we have is a problem of circular reportage. There have been limited efforts to actually send folk in to talk to locals. I've written a very extensive piece on what we can't know, not just we don't know, what we can't know about drones, and that's because of social desirability bias. I do a lot of survey work in Pakistan. I recently tried to do one in Fatah. By the way, NAF did a survey in Fatah. Complete garbage. You can't do it. People are afraid to answer questions about this. And basically put your human hat on. Some person that you don't know, or perhaps worse, someone that you do know, knocks on your door and says, oh, I heard that Mohammed Edie over there, his house, his compound was attacked by a drone. Do you know who was in there? What answer would you give? You're probably not going to say it was a terrorist. You're probably not going to want to say anything at all if you can avoid it. But the least dangerous answer is going to be, oh, innocent civilian killed by a drone, right? Because the Taliban aren't going to come after you if you say that. CIA, who knows what they're going to do, and the ISI, dog knows what they're going to do. So the least dangerous answer is, but the more innocent and the younger they are, the better that answer is. So in polling, this is social desirability bias, and we can't get around it. So what's the next step? You still got to try, right? You still got to try. You might find that brave, stupid soul that doesn't know what's good for him or her and actually answer the question honestly. So this is one thing that you can do. The next thing you can do is try to confirm there was in fact a burial. Why do I say that? You'd be surprised how rarely people have tried to do this in these drone reports. In Islam, burials are very important. If even these suicide bombers, folks will scramble to find a head, a toe, a finger, a chunk of thigh, something that they can bury. It's expensive, right? You have to. It depends on the muslik that you're talking about, but you have to have someone say last rites, there has to be a coffin, there has to be land. People will do the last rites, people will prepare what remains of the body. This is also a source of independent confirmation, and for the most part, very few folks have tried to do this, and when they do, by the way, they don't come up with, oh yes, there are all these innocent children and babies just blown to smithereens. The next thing you have to do, even if you've proven that someone was killed or injured, you have to prove they were killed or injured by a drone. I might add, in the case of Pakistan, you have to prove that they existed in the first place. I spent my entire career in Pakistan. By the way, I also lived in Chicago for 10 years. Nothing is easier than saying someone was killed who was never living to begin with. And by the way, it's very difficult in a country where there are no birth certificates and no death certificates. So this might sound like I'm being mean and facetious, but I'm not. So you have to prove that someone was alive, that someone was injured, or that someone was killed. Secondly, you have to prove that these things happened from a drone. This is not trivial either. If you look at where drone attacks happen, and I will call your attention to a paper called The Impact of U.S. Drone Strikes and Terrorism in Pakistan by Johnson and Sarbaghi. We can talk about the data they use. It's not perfect, but perhaps the best attempt. You find that drone strikes are co-located with terrorist incidents. What does that mean? It means that some of those children with things sticking out of their face may have been injured from shrapnel from a terrorist attack. And not only that, in many of these cases, there have been mill operations with conventional aircraft. So this does not mean that you can only have international lawyers running on the scene. You actually have to have some people that know forensics. Folks that can look at those injuries, they can look at the munitions that are alleged to have been used in drone strikes and discern whether or not those injuries are consistent with that kind of munition. And then obviously, whether or not the time frame, as evidenced by that injury, is consistent with the time frame when the drone strike happened. None of the BIJ efforts, the NAF efforts, what have you, have done this. I will say very humbly, I've been putting together a data set with Jacob Shapiro and a bunch of other folks. Data sets are hard. Josh can talk about some of the issues of coding. You're going through media accounts. By the way, the Taliban don't always claim the bad stuff they do, especially when things go far. They don't want to admit that they killed a bunch of innocent children, right? It's the same reason that we don't. So putting together a data set, it's easy for folks to sit here like me, and criticize NAF and BIJ, but I understand how hard it is I put together a data set. It's difficult to figure out what their dependent variable is, who are they targeting, who do they actually kill. Every newspaper will differ, and if you go away from the English and look at the Urdu, and I've done an experiment where I've coded this stuff in Urdu as well as in English, different worlds exist in these different media. So this is very, very hard to do. However, if the Pakistan government were sincere in its howling about drones, a point which obviously I deride because I don't believe it to be true, they would let UNAMA, which is the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, which also has an office in Pakistan, which also has a CPASS unit, set up a similar CPASS unit in Pakistan with some improvements. Worked with UNAMA, their CPASS unit tries to do it right, but they don't have any forensics guys and gals. So if the Pakistanis were serious at wanting to get to the bottom of who's being killed, they would let UNAMA set up a civilian casualty monitoring unit, and they would let some folks with some civilian evidence in there. They would also let other folks than local journalists in there. So there's a lot of things that we can do to try to get at a data set. But ultimately, for us to determine what the strategic effects of this program is, we have to know who the persons that were targeted, who they were in their respective organizations, what attacks were they responsible for, and who did we actually kill. That is critical because you're then putting forward an empirical pathway. What the Johnson and Soroki paper do, they only come up with a correlation. Increase of drones is correlated with a decrease in the rate of growth of terrorism. That's econometric speak for drones have some effect in dealing with the problem at hand. But there's no pathway because we can't say this individual was removed and he has, or she, usually he, has this role in the organization that attacked here and there and so forth, right? Without this information, we can't do a strategic assessment. Let me dispense very quickly with another claim, which is frequently made, and that is that drones make more terrorists than they kill. Unfortunately, those individuals have no other evidence than a quote by Don Rumsfeld. So I think I could rest my case there, but I won't. What we often think about in terrorism, that it's just the numbers. I'd like to draw your attention to the work of my colleague, Ethan Bueno de Mesquita, who has introduced this notion of the quality of terror. So even if we take, for purposes of argumentation, there are claims that drones make more terrorists, that is not the only metric that matters, right? It's also the quality. So going to one of the points that Ashley and Josh make, we want to assess, do drones have a permanent or at least an enduring effect on degrading the capability of terrorists? So we can't simply look at the number, right? We also have to know the kinds of attacks that they're doing. Are they coordinated? Are they hard targets? Are they soft targets? Do they involve infiltration of POC Mill and POC intelligence? Pulling off an MS Mehran is a lot more difficult than going in and blowing up a bunch of Shia during the Muharram procession. So I'm gonna end there. So I think I've gone over, and I do feel some looking at me. But all of this is to say, all of these data elements we don't presently have, and we probably won't have them because of the POC military and intelligence obfuscation, and also the CIA's obfuscation. But I think with some resources, we can actually get at this a little bit better. I do think another venue that we should all be clamoring for as Americans, provided that most of you are Americans, and that is more active oversight by the Senate Intelligence Committee. I'm not an ignoramus, I have a clearance, this involves pretty sensitive stuff. So, you know, we certainly don't want idiots out there like, who's that fellow who thinks rapists can't impregnate their victims? Rebecca, six-term houseman. Yes, who elected that buffoon? We don't want idiots like that talking about that for sure. But hopefully some people who can do some math, know some biology, and have a clearance can actually try to exercise more rigorous oversight over this problem set. I would also encourage Pakistanis to do the same. The reason why I encourage this is that the more Pakistanis demand transparency from their government, particularly from this parliament, who oddly enough may have been the best parliament that Pakistan has seen, it's going to be much better for their debate as well. So the folks that are suing the CIA, that's great, because to prevail in that lawsuit would require presentation of evidence, and I think evidence is what we're all looking for, right? So indirectly, even drone supporters like me will benefit from those lawsuit efforts. Without doing this, the drone program is simply not going to be sustainable for any number of reasons that we're all aware of in this room. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. I think part of assessing the strategic effect of the drones is to understand how we got to this place to begin with. First of all, it's worth bearing in mind the enemy they're being primarily used against, al-Qaeda. This is an organization that since 1998 has pledged itself to killing American civilians wherever they can be found, not just confined to the United States. This is an organization that has successfully planned and executed a mass casualty attack against American civilians in the United States. This is an organization that has vowed to carry out similar attacks and to use weapons of mass destruction if it can get its hands on them, to kill many people even if it can. And it has acted on this desire, most recently in the 2009 underwear bombing plot that nearly took down a plane over Detroit. And finally, this is an organization that plans a lot of its operations from hard-to-reach places. So it's a difficult enemy for a variety of reasons. They have the intent, they have the capability, and they've demonstrated over and over that they're not going to let up. But they're planning these things from areas that are very difficult, as Christine said, to get to. It's also useful to remember where our drone policy comes from. If any of you read Hank Crumpton's recent book, you'll recall in 2000, they had a Predator drone that was hovering over the Karnak farm, hovering for quite a long time. They had received human intelligence that bin Laden was going to be on the premises, and then from the camera on the drone, they actually identified somebody they believed to be bin Laden walking around for a long time right in the open, but they did not have a weapon on this drone. And the Clinton White House had to make the determination whether to send in a missile or not to hit this target that was most likely bin Laden. That missile would have taken 6 hours to get there. And allegedly someone showed President Clinton a picture of a play swing, and he assumed that there were children on this farm. And he worried if he waited 6 hours, bin Laden could have already gone and he could have killed innocents. This is where the drone program had been until 9/11. Of course, the 9/11 attacks changed the calculus of decision makers and sort of went in the opposite direction. One of the main drawbacks to our policy over the past 10 years has been the willingness to go in with large amounts of conventional forces into areas that puts not only many soldiers at risk, but also greatly destabilizes the countries we send them into. So I see the drone phenomenon and its use in places outside of the AFPAC border region as also a reaction to this overreaction, that policymakers are trying to pare back the use of violence, to use these more targeted strikes, not commit large number of human and financial resources. And Yemen has sort of become a laboratory of whether this new approach can work. So I think when you're evaluating the value of these airstrikes, some of which come from drones, some of which are based on intelligence gathered by drones, in evaluating these airstrikes, I think you have to ask yourself a series of questions. And I think the answers to these questions are increasingly difficult to come by. So I'll start with the easier questions. And of course, this is on a relative scale. As Christine just pointed out, the data is extremely hard to come by and has all sorts of caveats that go along with it. So I think the easiest question to ask is, do these drone strikes significantly drain our resources compared to other policy options? And I don't think they do. I think it's far less, of course, than invading a country or trying to occupy it, or going a step further and trying to actually build a nation. Second, do they reduce the threat of another large attack on the U.S. homeland? Because this is what terrifies policymakers. This is what will send this country into another unbalanced policy response, because the population cannot stand for another attack on the scale of 9/11. Perhaps even smaller, had the plane gone down over Detroit. God knows what would the response have been. I served in the State Department at the time, and it was a freak-out section for weeks and weeks, and this was a plot that didn't even transpire. But nevertheless, it completely derails the policymakers because the public outcry is so great. So do drones reduce this threat of another large-scale attack? I would say yes. I would say the absence of those attacks is some measure of proof. This is not a perfect measure, of course, and if an attack goes through, perhaps this would cause people to question whether this can be a measure, but I think it has to be on the table. You cannot argue convincingly that drones aren't effective and dismiss the fact that there have been no attacks on these countries, particularly since we have evidence, and I think Aaron will probably touch on some of this, that internally the leadership of al-Qaeda has been very excised about the drone attacks, and we've seen that they've greatly degraded the ability of al-Qaeda Central and al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula to carry out overseas external operations. So I do think they're valuable in that way. The next level of difficulty, if we're going on the scale, is the question, is it empowering, though, these strikes, al-Qaeda fundraising and recruitment? This is a really difficult question to answer, particularly in Pakistan and Yemen, where it's hard to send out survey groups, ask people questions, expect to get credible answers back. I will say that the people who argue that it does increase recruitment often point to this line from John Brennan that al-Qaeda membership in Yemen has gone from hundreds to now thousands. And I would only observe that there's also an insurgency being waged, and that in this kind of environment, when the state has collapsed, there's a lot more incentives that are at play that draw people into these groups more than or in competition with just a desire for vengeance. They don't just join up because family members have been killed. So that's an even more difficult question to get at. And then finally is the larger, and to me the greatest strategic level question. And that is it, Christine already set me up for failure here, but is it breeding more anti-American terrorists in the future? And I think it's a valuable question to ask. If you're going to look at a country like Yemen, al-Qaeda is difficult to get at. You have to have, or in order for these drone strikes to work, the thinking is you have to have the agreement with the local government. You have to provide some goodies to the local government. These goodies are often in the form of security assistance. This is security assistance is not used for things that we would like. And so the question then is, are you supporting a regime and a regime crackdown on dissent that is going to lead to more anti-American violence in the future? And to the extent that America is seen complicit in this crackdown on dissent, particularly when there's a mass mobilization clamoring for more political inclusion in Yemen, I think the answer is yes. I think drone policy, if it's carried out at its current tempo, does put the United States at the very top of the bad guy list, not because you're going after al-Qaeda, but rather this unqualified support we give to a regime that is currently involved in a crackdown on its citizens. And this kind of crackdown, we know from people who studied it in other countries, when Islamists mobilize on a mass level for more political inclusion and the regime responds by denying them inclusion and then cracking down indiscriminately, this breeds terrorist violence of some of the worst sort. And I think Algeria is one of the archetypes of what can happen. And the United States risks aligning itself with just such a regime. So I'll leave it there. Pass it to Aaron.
All right, so, well, we've just heard a little bit about sort of this from the strategic level for the United States, what they're doing. I'm going to be talking a little bit about how al-Qaeda and some of the other jihadis in Pakistan and Yemen are looking at this, how it's changed them, and then how they're also trying to use this in their propaganda themselves. So one of the major issues that they've been trying to deal with over the last few years is the issue of spies. One of the things that people have to remember is that while there are robots in the sky, we also have individuals on the ground who are putting tracking devices on cars or even houses and the like, so that individuals who are doing the drone strikes can then target the specific person. So one of the issues that al-Qaeda's had to deal with is dealing with spies. And in the Abbottabad documents, bin Laden actually called the tribal areas in Pakistan the circle of espionage. So it's clearly an issue that they've been trying to deal with. And even Abu Yahya al-Libi, who recently was allegedly killed in a drone strike, wrote a book in 2009 about how to deal with spies. Another area that has sort of changed what al-Qaeda's been trying to do is that a lot of individuals have moved out of the tribal areas into urban areas such as Karachi, or even gone back into Afghanistan in places such as Kunar province. As sort of as another example about the issue of spies is that a Taliban commander once said that you never know who's the difference between a reporter and who's the difference between a spy, which creates a level of paranoia on their part and who they can let in and speak to and who they're allowing into their inner circles. And even to further talk about what bin Laden said in one of the Abbottabad documents is that he was warning individuals that even if they do feel safe in a certain spot, they should always be looking over their shoulder, which is a good thing in terms of what the United States is doing because they're becoming more paranoid about who they're interacting with and bringing into their own organizations, which then could potentially create more of a bunker mentality. Another issue has been the degraded ability to train fighters in Pakistan. Al-Qaeda used to be able to have training courses for bomb makers that could take upwards up to a month, if not longer, and then even have graduate courses for high-level bomb making. Now you only really see it for a few days, and a lot of the times it's contracted out to other groups such as the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan or even Lashkar-e-Taiba. One example that sort of shows this lack of ability to train these individuals in bomb making is the Times Square plot in 2010 when Faisal Shahzad tried to blow up his car. Bomb experts showed that the bomb was pretty amateurish and that he wasn't, even if he was able to light a fuse, nothing probably would have happened. So that was one example. Another example, turning to Yemen, is that in a lot of cases they now have mobile and roving training camps where individuals will just meet up in a certain location in Yemen, practice firing AK-47s, RPGs and the like, and then they'll melt away into the desert. So turning now to the propaganda front, although Al-Qaeda in Pakistan and the Taliban have been under severe drone duress for the past 4+ years, they more or less have been mum about this issue in their propaganda. It is possible, though, that they are speaking about this on the local level in a face-to-face manner, but in terms of the stuff they put out on the internet, they barely touched upon it. Since this talk is short, there's only really 2 major examples from Al-Qaeda, but if anybody's interested, I can get more specific about that. And then, according to some research by a Kandahar-based researcher, the Taliban has rarely, if it ever, talked about it in their commentary, and it's only really come from the Haqqanis and not the Quetta Shura. Unlike Al-Qaeda in Pakistan and Taliban, AQAP has only been under the drone duress for about 1.5 years, but they've exploited the issue greatly in their media work. One of the areas that they've talked about is sort of countering spies. This was shown in a recent video that they put out this past spring where they had a Sharia court and convicted 3 individuals of spying on them for putting tracking devices on cars. One of the individuals was crucified in Azan, which is a small town in southern Yemen, and then another individual, which they actually showed in one of their video messages, was shot at point-blank range in around a circle in Shabwa. So they're clearly trying to show not only to the individuals on the local level, like, look, if you're going to work with the Saudis, the Americans, or the British, we're going to find you and we're going to kill you in a really brutish way. But also it's a message to, the United States and the allies that, look, you guys are sending these guys in, we're going to catch them. Though at the same time, as we saw a month or so ago, there was that British spy that helped get the most recent tech of the underwear bomb that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula was trying to get. Another area that AQAP has focused on in their newsletter that they put out by their front group Ansar al-Sharia is questioning America's integrity, showing pictures of dead children, and then also pointing out the policy of signature strikes, which is aiming at individuals based on behavior instead of necessarily knowing who the individual is and if they're actually a member of the organization. So that's been one of their major critiques. And then lastly, one of the issues they've talked about, as many in the West have talked about in their critiques of the program, is the killing of Anwar Awlaki as well as his son Abdul Rahman. They talking about how whether or not the U.S. is committed to the rule of law, which is somewhat interesting coming from Al-Qaeda's perspective, and whether they've gotten due process. So then the question becomes, what about blowback? Many individuals are worried about radicalization and also whether this will lead to more plots. Well, at least from the case of Al-Qaeda in Pakistan, we really haven't seen any plots in revenge for drone strikes. The closest we might have come in terms of an individual pointing out that they were doing their plot was the Faisal Shahzad case, actually, because one of the reasons he said, allegedly, that he wanted to do the Times Square bombing was the increase of the drone strikes in the tribal belt. There's also this plot that never occurred by Ilyas Kashmiri, who's an external operator for Al-Qaeda, who was actually killed by a drone last year himself. He wanted to kill the CEO of Lockheed Martin, but this never came to fruition. So where does that sort of leave us now? Yes, many leaders in Al-Qaeda Central in Pakistan, AQAP, Shabab in Somalia, and even some fighters in the Taliban, the IMU, Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, and the TTP, Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, have been killed, but it has allowed some of these groups to build up counter-spy networks and beef up some of their operational security. At the same time, Al-Qaeda's ability to operate has been severely degraded. It does not appear, though, to have had an appreciable impact on the Taliban in terms of being able to project themselves back into Afghanistan. And while AQAP has not been successful in their attacks, they still have been able to been the most successful in trying to put devices onto planes. At the very least, it's created a nuisance as well as contained more egregious actions that might have otherwise occurred. On the other hand, there are still many lingering questions regarding whether this is radicalizing any individuals, especially in the case of Yemen. Appreciating how the drones are affecting, changing, and evolving these groups from their vantage point can at the very least provide a new perspective and a very vexing challenge that the United States is dealing with.
Boy, honestly, we didn't intend to stack the deck here in favor of drones, but I know that Josh has some strong opinions about it, and I'm going to turn this back over to Josh. And Josh, if we can pull the microphone down to him and let Josh give some comments, maybe in response to our three panelists, and then maybe we'll get a brief conversation going among us here, and then I'll turn it over to questions.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I want to thank the three of you for coming in. One of the reasons why Ashley and I wrote this paper is the lack of empirical data driving the discussion. And I think highlighting the challenges and being able to collect that information should be inspiring a certain amount of humility about our ability to draw conclusions about drones, about how they function, and then also about the effects that they have. We can all make educated guesses based on our own experiences, but ultimately they remain educated guesses, and it's important to keep that in mind. Also, I want to highlight something in part as a bit of a warning for the question and answer period. We have been very deliberately avoiding the political issues of why drone strikes are happening within the Obama administration. We've also been deliberately avoiding the morality question of whether it's appropriate for the United States to engage in targeted killings. And one of these is because as moral questions, and in one case, as sort of a philosophical question about the proper use of power within the presidency, that's not something you can have an empirical discussion about. And because the empirical discussion is what's not happening, that's what we're trying to limit ourselves to here. That being said, what I find most striking about this is the fact that the little bit that we can find shows that drones are very useful in a lot of ways. They're good at going into places where we don't have a lot of presence. They're good at killing people that we can identify as being threats or being suspected threats is probably the best way of putting it. But at the same time, we're still not entirely sure about all of the effects that they're having. And this comes back to the empirical data question. And I think just leaving that on the table of we think that they kind of work, but we really don't have the data to say exactly what effects they have is, at least for me, one of the big takeaways that I'm getting from this is that the data for this remains so poor. And one of the reasons why the data are so poor is because the governments involved don't like talking about it. That it makes it hard for us on the outside to actually come up with definitive statements about what it is that they're going to be accomplishing in the long term. So I think with that in mind, we could probably see if any of you guys have follow-up statements and then go to the audience.
Christine, go ahead.
Yeah, so just, one point that, so I am, for reasons that I noted within the strict case of FATA, a drone proponent. But I will say that I always say that with this ellipses, for the following reason. I'm pretty confident based on my conversations with Pak Mil, even Pakistani political officials as well as the gambit of Americans, that once we've decided that we're going to kill someone, that we can probably kill that person and we can do it in such a way that we can minimize the folks that we don't actually want to kill. But what I am very bothered by, and this goes to the points that Josh made, what did that person do that made them drone worthy? Even if we have alternative, even if there are no other ways of killing that person, what made that person drone worthy? And the reason why I'm terribly bothered by the fact that we don't publicly say, we tried to kill this person, we believe we killed this person, that instead we have to go through this Byzantine, series of leaks from the media, and then the American Embassy in Pakistan doesn't confirm or doesn't disconfirm. I'm still left with, I'm fairly convinced that we killed that person. But did that person deserve to die? And the other thing, and again, this really narrowly focuses on the Pakistan case, I'm equally bothered by the fact that the Pakistanis themselves have been so complicit in this conspiracy of nonsense, of lying to their own people in the same way that we're all being deceived in various ways. I think we could all agree that it would be much more efficacious if there could be an enforcement operation where the individual could be taken and then subject to the limits of the law interrogated for further information. So I don't want you to leave based upon my comments that I am without qualification or question a drone supporter. Every single day I wake up and ask myself, do I still support drones? And there will probably be that drone attack, or there will probably be some leak that makes me seriously question the efficacy of this program and at least the way in which it's being weighed. So I don't want to diminish the moral issues, because the moral issues are unfortunately deeply tied to those empirical issues. But we can't even have that moral discussion without access to the empirics.
Any of you guys?
Yeah, just a quick note. I mean, in addition to the data consisting of kills, what that person did in the organization, whether they were in the organization at all, we have to also evaluate what are the trade-offs that the United States is having to make. In real terms, what kind of money, what kind of security force assistance do we have to provide to these countries where drone strikes are being carried out, and what is the effect on that country of that kind of assistance?
I just wanted to point out that while I was sort of broadly talking about al-Qaeda in Pakistan as well as al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and Yemen, I think it's important to sort of decouple these in some respects in terms of understanding them based on what's going on in their local environments as well and how that may affect them. And that we should keep that in mind, at least when we're trying to understand what's going on in those particular zones of war.
Oh, right. A new term in my lexicon, drone-worthy. Have to keep an eye on that, see who's drone-worthy. All right, we'd like to open it up to questions, and if I could see who we got here. Yes, sir, right here.
I'm Dave Darnell, the Atlanta Council. Chrissy, it seems to me that the question about the unmanned distinction isn't so much that the navigator, the trigger puller aren't human beings. Clearly it is, regardless of how you're doing it. Is that there's not anybody up there that's going to get shot down. And while that makes it a great thing from the standpoint of force protection, does it change your tactical decision? Would we be doing, say, signature strikes to the extent that we do with manned vehicles? If you had to have, sort of manned patrols out there, if you had to take the time to actually send out the mission, would you do it less frequently? Would you do it with more care than if you just got a drone out there anyway and, hey, there's some guys acting suspicious, there's a truck, but it was blown off?
Let me weigh in on this. And I wish you and Ashley had perhaps dilated upon this more in the important piece that you wrote. There's this idea that drone strikes, the entire human package to execute a drone strike is somehow less than the human package to carry out a conventional strike with the pilots in the aircraft. For those of you that are familiar with drone pilots and lawyers, there's actually more people involved in assembling that drone targeting package than there is in a conventional strike. I was actually quite happy or glad to see that some of the press had begun picking up on the fact that drone pilots actually have a considerable amount of post-traumatic stress. Unlike a conventional pilot that will drop the payload and go, as we know, many of these drones will remain hovering over the target site. The reason is we want to collect secondary information. Obviously many of the bad guys will come to try and find some parts to bury. And so they're actually loitering in that site. And with the ways in which the graphic interface is changing, these are not, like the Nintendo, the Atari set, certainly in my youth, although I'm looking around, I'm a lot older than a lot of folks here in this town. So I do want to put that out there. That being said, since, to quote Richard Clark when he was first thinking about putting a Hellfire on a drone, and the Air Force objected, the drone might get blown up. He says, that's the point, we'll go out to dinner, the drone will get blown up. I don't not discount your point, but I also don't want people thinking that somehow drones are less human intensive. There are more lawyers on the ground, there are more intelligence analysts, because the costs of screwing this up are actually higher in a way than we actually appreciate. That being said, the objective, I believe, of UAVs is that they really will be unmanned, right? If you look at some of the folks that have been looking at future generation unmanned systems, the whole point is to actually have them unmanned, that they will recognize the target, that they'll act according to criteria, and we won't actually have a need for 150 people sitting around a room evaluating a target. That's why I am, even though I support drones in FATA for reasons that I noted and the conditions that I did, as a citizen, I'm very bothered by this, because what we've seen is we've had this questions remain, the techniques of killing are changing, and they're being marketized. I remember years ago when I was a land corporation analyst looking at in vitro fertilization. Bear with me for a second. That stuff was brought to market before we even had the moral and ethical and safety debates, right? And then once the demand for that product is out there, it's very difficult to suck it back. So I am concerned that the whole goal of drones is to in fact have them be unmanned. They will operate on a set of criteria that are pre-programmed, while we're still sitting here in think tanks having discussions that are at a level that are so remotely behind the technology and the goals. So I don't think that the pilot issue is just an issue of semantics in the future, but I also don't want us to downplay the human-intensive footprint of a drone strike. And I'm glad you raised the point of the spotters, the chippers. By the way, this is something, it's a fake binary that we're offering, drones or human-intensive. I would argue, and the reason why I ended with the drones won't be sustainable if we keep this going as we're doing in Pakistan, the reason why they're so effective is we have this huge willing network of collaborators, or whatever you want to call them, on the ground. They're willing to chip people, they're willing to provide information. This continued and sustained political disconnect will simply make that thing a flying killing system without the infrastructure on the ground that makes it an effective and targeted killing system.
And just to follow up on that briefly, I mean, targeted strikes have been conducted by manned aircraft.
Exactly.
In Libya, Somalia, I think even in Yemen, AC-130 gunships have conducted targeted signature strikes on people. So there you still have a manned aircraft, people in it directly pulling the trigger physically on the airplane. So I mean, I share everyone's hesitation at the idea of killing people we can't positively identify and can't positively establish as like legitimate concrete threats. But I think I do agree with Chris that the manned-unmanned distinction is a little semantic in that sense, because even with manned aircraft, you're still using the same system that was set up to discriminate drone targets, and so therefore they're part of this killing system that we're talking about.
Yes, sir, in the back on the right there.
Yes, sir. My name is Cami, but I'm with the Pakistani Spectator, and my question is that if Bibi Netanyahu gets determined to make Obama pack his bags, do you think Obama would divert attention by raining more drones in Pakistan or even putting American boots in Fatah? And my second question is about if you guys know if there is any system designed that when we Americans determine that these numbers were innocents, they were not terrorists, do we compensate them? And I'm asking this second question because I'm a Punjabi, and as you guys know, Lashkar-e-Taiba is probably next al-Qaeda. And this is how most Punjabi think that we show zero respect for those people's lives. First of all, we have put this Mr. Idiot, Mr. 10%, we support them and we have forced them, like Pakistani have committed some serious sin, and we are giving them this punishment by supporting Mr. 10%. And now we are showing very little respect by training those drones on poor Pakistanis. Thanks.
Okay, so for the first one about putting boots on the ground in Fatah, that's not going to happen. Probably ever. I mean, about compensation, the U.S. does that in Afghanistan because the U.S. has a presence there. I mean, there's no infrastructure to do that in Pakistan. I don't think that's ever been on the table. Unless...
Actually, it has been on the table.
Okay.
It has been on the table. The problem is one of evidence. You have to show that this person was alive. They were killed by basically all those things that I've said. So there have been efforts. There's even been at least one lawsuit waged against, filed by Pakistanis on behalf of drone victims targeting the CIA. They have an issue of collecting evidence. I did a very unfortunate Al Jazeera interview with that fellow. I'm like, I applaud you, because the more evidence you can collect, the more it helps this debate. But the fact is, you can't collect that evidence. So it is on the table. I think, by the way, there should be. If we kill someone who's innocent, there should be compensation. We do it in Afghanistan. I don't think the CIA does it. I think that's because there's two kinds of drones in Afghanistan. One's covert, one's overt. We will use drones like we do any other aircraft under troops and contact situations. So I think we should use compensation discussion. We can only have that compensation discussion when the Pakistan government comes clean and when the CIA comes clean. Incidentally, I know people in the State Department that, again, speaking only on Pakistan, want to be able to have a real discussion about this, because it's embarrassing for them to be at a press release and some ISI, ISPR planted journalist, we may use that word so loosely, asks an obviously pre-planned question, and the poor guy or gal sitting there at the embassy can't say anything, right? Because they can't even acknowledge it was a drone strike. So I think we should be willing to consider compensation.
Christine, those are interesting insights. Yes, sir, all the way in the back.
Hi, David Colton. Going back to Josh's point about the empirical framework, or trying to put empirical framework, I was wondering if we could talk about the larger global picture and the empiricism, not of what a targeted group might do, but what other major powers, the lessons they're drawing from our drone campaign and the precedent we're setting. For example, the Russians have just concluded a joint venture with the Israelis with the explicit purpose of catching up with U.S. drone technology in the next 10 years. What will U.S. policy be when the Russians start using drones for targeted killing in Georgia, or targeted killing in Tajikistan, where the GRU sets up kill teams and kill chains for dissidents abroad? What happens when the Chinese start using drones in signature strikes in Tibet, in Nepal? Has there been any empirical analysis on what other global powers have started drone programs, what the state of their drone programs are, and what they're saying based on what the U.S. precedent has been? Thank you.
There has been some empirical, I mean, the Department of Defense studies this, and they occasionally publish unclassified assessments of what other countries' drone capabilities are. What I find striking about those is that the U.S. and to a lesser extent Israel are light years beyond everyone else in terms of drone technology, and especially in terms of being able to establish a sufficient basis of intelligence to come up with targeting packages on people. I mean, Russia can try as hard as it wants. Its military is still decrepit. It's still a 20th of our military size, so they have a 20th of the resources to throw at it. And frankly, it's the same thing with China. In terms of really precision, high technology weaponry, they're very, very far behind us in a lot of ways, especially on drones and remotely piloted operations. So I mean, that is a concern in the future. The proliferation of any new weapons platform is always going to be a concern, but it's not an immediate concern. So from the U.S. government perspective, that's a long-term thing that people are worrying about. But I mean, even in the next 5, possibly 10 years, there aren't going to be people with an equivalent capacity to what we have right now. So I don't think, I mean, I'm not speaking from insider knowledge here, but I don't get the sense that there is this really urgent need to try to either monitor or in some way stymie parallel developments of this platform.
No, but your point's well taken. Perhaps we ought to be thinking about it, and certainly get our own house in order first.
Exactly, and like I said, I mean, proliferation of a new weapon is always a problem. It was a problem with nukes, it was a problem with, you know, cruise missiles, it was a problem with the airplane. When the airplane was first invented, they're like, oh God, what if everyone has airplanes? What do we do? But ultimately, like, that's a lesson, is that once a weapon is proliferated, you understand what it is, you understand how to defend against it. Drones are really vulnerable. That's the other side of it. Georgia can shoot down drones. They have. They've shot down Russian drones, and they still do to this day. In other places where drones might be used, either in Tajikistan, they can be shot down there as well because they have Russian equipment that was designed to target aircraft. It's fairly sophisticated. So ultimately, you know, the U.S. is the only country, I think, that's even developing stealth drones. And there, the biggest threat to them has been piloting error and software failures, not they're getting shot down or they're even being used in some way. So, I mean, it's not just a question of once you have a drone in the air, then it's this invulnerable killing machine that can never be stopped. I mean, a Predator is basically a toy airplane with some missiles attached to it. So those are easy to knock out of the sky. You can shoot it with a handgun and poke holes in its wings and it'll spiral down. So, I mean, there is a concern there. There's definitely a concern, but, I mean, they're not, you know, we're not talking about Arnold Schwarzenegger in a sci-fi movie here. We're talking about very vulnerable aircraft. So I think it's important to keep that in mind as well.
Yes, sir. All the way back on the right.
Sidney Freeberg, AOL Defense. Two questions. One is, you know, we've talked about, you know, these are actually remotely or, you know, operated, remotely manned or aircraft. From the Pakistani perspective in particular, does the fact that these are, you know, killer robots, as it were, change the propaganda dynamic, change the public reaction, change the level of outrage in a way that would be different from either manned aircraft or, for that matter, the Israeli approach of having human agents doing targeted killings on the ground with, limpet mines on cars, or blowing poison in people's ears, and all those other things which have also had some backblast in the past. And also, I just want to make sure I'm fully understanding. I think what people are saying with the data is that are people saying, that a lot of the killings, a lot of the collateral damage we hear reported out of Pakistan, out of the Fatah, may in fact be unsubstantiated. In fact, maybe these numbers that we hear and see in these databases of innocents killed may be substantially inflated.
I'll touch the last part of that. Actually, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism came out with this big anti-drone package. But what I found striking about it was in their attempt to positively identify everyone who'd been killed, they found that only about 500 of their estimated 2,500 casualties from drone strikes have been positively identified. So, I mean, even with people trying and putting in a great deal of effort to show that there's this enormous innocent civilian toll from drone strikes, they were only able to show that about a fifth of the reported drone casualties have any sort of positive ID behind them. For the remaining 2,000 who supposedly been killed by drones, we have no idea who they are. We don't know if they're good, bad, if they existed, if they don't exist, we just don't know. And that, I think that gets at the data question, is that because the fidelity of the data is so bad, it's really hard to make definitive statements about it. As for the Pakistan stuff.
So look, there's a strategic, I mean, at the end of the day, we're all looking at really lousy data, and we're putting value judgments on it, and some of us get to go to places where others don't. So, for example, one of the most important conversations I think I ever had was with a former 11th Corps commander who said to me, drones don't kill innocent people, was Baytullah Masood's wife innocent? For those of you who don't know Baytullah Masood's wife, she was giving him a massage when the drones took her out. She wasn't, coupling him. She wasn't saying, oh, you horrible terrorists, get away from me. Incidentally, her own father took both of them. So this is a complexity. This is a complex debate in any system. Someone who's aiding and abetting a terrorist would not be innocent, right? And that's exactly what this Corps commander told me. But the discourse in Pakistan is very pernicious. This is my interpretation. We're free to agree to disagree. The Pakistanis. By Pakistan, I'm talking about ISPR and the ISI. Right? They cultivate anti-Americanism, and I can go through copious examples. If you want to go to a bar around the corner, I can regale you with countless tales. Why do they do this? They do this because the Pakistanis don't really want a strategic relationship with us. Right? They want the money without the strategic requirements. And so, for example, Raymond Davis, Salhalla, even the Kerry Lugar bourbon, and obviously every drone strike presents an opportunity to whip up anti-Americanism through Pakistan's. It's the most vivacious media that can be bought. Unfortunately, USA is in a very bad time of buying its own story on Pakistan's media. I'm not joking about that. I'm actually being quite serious. So they cultivate this enormous wellspring of anti-Americanism that the Pak military, the ISI, can then use to negotiate what it doesn't want to do. Well, we would really like to do that, but it's very inflammatory. And so I have a hypothesis that if one day when all this stuff is declassified, the numbers of innocent women and children that are reported in a drone strike would be directly proportionate to how much that particular terrorist was important to the ISI, right? So if it was a goodwill kill, we're going to see relatively few innocent women and children reported. If it is really close to the Haqqani network, oh my God, 130 fetuses were killed. So the Pakistan, I'm like partly being facetious there. So the Pakistan discourse is very, very complicated. From my point of view, the current political government sitting in Pakistan has had a very difficult time. I think it's important that we recognize that the deal that we have, which is we bomb Fatah and the Pakistanis scream about it, was cut by Musharraf, which is President Bush and then President Musharraf. This Pakistani civilian government, which doesn't really control these facets of foreign policy, bears the price, right? The army's not elected, the civilians are. So they're having to walk a very complicated line by the fact that many of this PDP leadership has experienced the brunt of terrorism. I'll remind you about Benazir Bhutto, possibly killed by Baytullah Masood. This predatory military that's just waiting for them to F up so they can take over, and trying to thread a population which is very angry about foreign as well as domestic policy. I wish that the PP government had come in and said, listen, the terrorists are killing you. The numbers we can debate, anywhere between 10,000 and 30,000 Pakistanis have been killed since 9/11. We need the drones. Pak-Mil can't do it, they're displacing people. And they had used the opportunity with the Tula Masood killing to reorient the debate. I will say, and then I will shut up, that if you talk to Pakistanis from Fatah, and again, I've been very fortunate because I've been able to have those discussions, there's a very big difference between those who have experienced the drones directly and those who have not. Those who have experienced the drones in the locality where these kaminas, to use an Urdu word, which is not a nice word, operate, they know who's being killed and they know what's happening. And they tend to be very positively inclined towards drones. When you get away from people who've had direct experience, you find this very hostile opinion about drones being evoked, even in Fatah itself. I'll draw your attention to the New American Foundation survey from, I believe it was 2 years ago. Very bad survey, despite their best effort. I just did a very bad survey in Fatah. You can't do a good survey in Fatah for a number of reasons. But the most important thing they did not do, which on a survey about drones you think is important, they never asked respondents, have you personally seen a drone? So unfortunately, what the NAF survey tells us, what we already knew, people who don't know drones, don't see drones, don't like drones.
I think we have time for one more question. Anybody? Yes, sir.
Ace Brown. The question is really for Eric or Will, whoever can speak more to this. During the discussion, you mentioned that mostly AQAP, who is really benefiting, is really pulling numbers in, trying to recruit through discussing drones. Why isn't that really being echoed by other jihadi groups, or is it need enough time to really get into depth about it?
I think it's different in the case of Yemen because they're trying to talk to a local audience too, whereas in the case of al-Qaeda in Pakistan, a lot of the guys in that group are not Pakistani, so they don't have the same kind of necessarily tribal ties per se, though of course there are members of al-Qaeda in Pakistan that have married into some of those families, but I think that's part of what's going on there, is that there's a more close familial tie in a lot of these instances, and they're trying to bring some of the tribes over onto their side and really exploit the issue for local reasons.
That's a good answer.
Well, I hope you enjoyed our debate today and what our panelists have had to offer. ASP is going to keep on top of this subject. We're going to put out a couple more papers on it, probably convene a group to study it here through the fall. So we appreciate your support, appreciate you coming in. Please hit our website. We will put this up on the website. Let's give a big hand to our panelists.